Zitkala was a young Apache woman who had always been caught between two worlds. She was born into the Apache tribe, with a rich culture and history. But she also grew up during a time when the American settlers were expanding into the lands that her people had lived on for centuries. In the beginning, she was like any other child, curious, energetic, and full of life. She loved the stories her grandmother told her about the old ways of her people, the songs, the dances, and the strength of the Apache warriors. But as she grew older, she began to see the world differently. The Apache were no longer the powerful and independent nation they once were. Their lands were being stolen by outsiders, their people hunted, and their way of life slowly fading away. Zitkala had always been close to her family and her people, but she also felt the weight of the changes happening around her. She could feel the divide between the Apache and the settlers growing wider, and she knew that something had to change. It wasn't that she hated the settlers. In fact, she had learned many things from them over the years: tools, ideas, and even ways of farming. She had witnessed peaceful exchanges between the two groups and believed that there was a possibility for both sides to live side by side, in harmony, but not everyone agreed with her. Many of the Apache, particularly the warriors and elders who had grown up in a time when they were the rulers of the land, saw Zitkala's beliefs as a form of betrayal. They felt that she had forgotten their ways, that she was too willing to surrender to the settlers. They believed that the only way for the Apache to survive was to resist, by force if necessary. Zitkala's desire for peace was seen as weakness. Her refusal to completely abandon the settlers' way of life made her an outsider in her own tribe. Her beliefs became a source of anger for some of her people, and soon rumors spread that Zitkala was marked for death. She had become a symbol of everything that the traditional Apache warriors despised. If she was allowed to live, it would send the message that it was okay to compromise with the settlers, that the Apache culture was weak and could be easily replaced. For some, this was unforgivable. Zitkala felt the fear creeping into her heart. She knew that she had made enemies in her own tribe, but she didn't want to believe that anyone would go as far as to take her life. However, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it was a very real possibility. She had already seen the terrible things the Apache warriors were capable of, and the thought of her life being taken away in such a brutal manner filled her with dread. One cold morning, as the sun began to rise over the desert hills, Zitkala was walking alone along the edge of a small creek near her village when she was suddenly surrounded by a group of Apache warriors. They moved quickly and silently, like shadows in the early morning light. Zitkala barely had time to react before they seized her, binding her arms and dragging her towards their camp. She struggled, but there was no use. The warriors were strong and their grip was unyielding. As they pulled her along, Zitkala's mind raced. She knew what was coming. She had heard the stories, how the Apache would sometimes execute those who were seen as traitors, those who had brought shame upon their people. It wasn't just the settlers who were dangerous. It was the very people she had grown up with, those she had loved and respected. They took her to a secluded area where a large fire was burning. The elders and warriors gathered around her, and Zitkala could feel their eyes on her, eyes full of anger, judgment, and something else: fear. They feared what she represented: change, weakness, the end of their way of life. But Zitkala did not bow her head. She stood tall, her chest rising and falling with each breath, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overtake her. As they prepared to carry out their decision, one of the warriors stepped forward. He was young, no more than 20, with sharp eyes that looked like they had seen too much pain. His name was Tasha, and he had once been a friend of Zitkala. They had played together as children, laughing and running through the fields as the sun set behind the mountains. Now he was one of the warriors who had come to take her life. "Tasha," Zitkala whispered, her voice shaking but steady. "You remember me, don't you? We were children once before all this." Tasha didn't speak at first. He simply looked at her, his face unreadable. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I remember. But you have changed, Zitkala. You've forgotten who you are." "I haven't forgotten anything," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "I've only learned that we don't have to fight each other. We can find a way to live together." Tasha's face hardened, and he turned away, signaling to the others to continue. The moment of truth had come. Zitkala closed her eyes, preparing for what she thought was her final moment. But before the warriors could carry out their plan, a sudden shout echoed through the camp. "Stop! The voice was firm and filled with authority. It came from someone outside the circle of warriors. They all turned to see a man on horseback, riding fast towards them. The horse kicked up clouds of dust as the rider approached, and when he came into view, Zitkala's heart skipped a beat. It was Samuel Wells, a rancher from the nearby settlement. He wasn't a soldier or a lawman, just a man who had lived in the area for years, quietly tending his land. He wasn't someone who sought conflict, and he wasn't someone anyone would expect to ride into an Apache camp to stop an execution. But there he was, holding his ground, staring down the warriors. "Let her go," Samuel called out, his voice steady and calm. "She doesn't deserve this." The warriors looked at one another, confusion and suspicion written on their faces. Samuel wasn't armed with more than a simple rifle and his horse. He was no threat to them, but he wasn't backing down either. "Why should we listen to you?" Tasha demanded, his hand resting on his sword. "Because I've seen enough bloodshed," Samuel replied, his eyes locked on Zitkala's captors. "I've seen enough of your people and the settlers killing each other." "Is this really what you want? To kill one of your own?" The camp fell silent. The warriors, who were usually so sure of their actions, seemed uncertain now. Samuel had said something they couldn't ignore. For a moment it felt as though the world had stopped moving. Zitkala looked up at Samuel, her heart filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. She had no idea why he had come or how he had found her, but somehow he had, and in that moment he was her only hope. As the tension in the camp grew thick, Samuel held his ground. He knew this was dangerous, and he had no idea what the outcome would be. But one thing was clear to him: Zitkala deserved a chance to live, and he wasn't about to let this moment slip away. It was the beginning of something that neither Samuel nor Zitkala could have predicted, but it was also the beginning of a fight that would change both of their lives forever. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Samuel's presence seemed almost unreal, like a vision from a dream. How had he arrived here, of all places, in the middle of the Apache camp? He had no official rank, no military background, and yet there he was, facing down a group of Apache warriors, demanding that they release Zitkala. The Apache warriors shifted nervously, their eyes darting between Samuel and each other. Some looked ready to attack, while others seemed unsure, their hands twitching toward their weapons but not yet drawing them. Tasha, the young warrior who had once been close to Zitkala, stood at the center of the group. He was confused, torn between his duty to his people and his lingering memories of the girl he had known. Zitkala, still bound by the ropes, looked up at Samuel with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. How had he known where to find her? Why would he risk his life for someone like her? She knew he wasn't a soldier, but even soldiers were afraid of the Apache. For a settler like Samuel to show up here in the heart of Apache territory was an incredible act of bravery, or foolishness. She couldn't decide which. "Let her go," Samuel repeated, his voice firm but calm. His horse pawed at the ground, its breath coming in heavy bursts. "She's not your enemy." Tasha finally spoke, his voice low and filled with the weight of tradition. "You don't understand," he said, his eyes locked onto Samuel's. "She is a traitor to our people. She has chosen the settlers over her own kin." Samuel shook his head. "That's not true," he said. "Zitkala has always tried to bring peace. She believes we can live together, Apache and settlers, but killing her won't solve anything. It will just create more hatred, more bloodshed." For a long moment the two men stared at each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. The Apache warriors, sensing the uncertainty, remained still, waiting for someone to make a move. The fire crackled in the background, casting flickering shadows across the scene. It was as though the whole world was holding its breath. Zitkala felt her heart race. She could see that Samuel was trying to reason with them, but she wasn't sure it would work. The Apache were fiercely protective of their ways, and many still held deep resentment toward the settlers. The idea of a white man telling them what to do in their own camp would likely only inflame their anger. Tasha, the young warrior, glanced at the other men, his brow furrowed in thought. He was still struggling with what to do. Part of him wanted to let Zitkala go, to agree with Samuel and stop the violence before it escalated further. But the other part of him, trained by his elders, raised on the belief that the Apache way was the only way, told him that allowing Zitkala to live would be a betrayal of everything he had been taught. Finally, Tasha spoke again. "You're wrong," he said, his voice heavy. "This is about our survival. We cannot let people like her weaken us. If we let one person slip away, others will follow, and soon we will have nothing left. Samuel's face softened, but he stood his ground. And what do you think will happen if you kill her? More people will rise up against you. The settlers won't back down, and the Apache won't either. It will just keep going, forever. More blood, more lives lost. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Samuel wasn't just speaking for Zitkala's life. He was speaking for the future of both their peoples. The battle between settlers and the Apache had already claimed too many lives. Samuel knew it could not continue like this, or it would destroy everyone. Zitkala, still bound by the ropes, could feel the heat of the fire against her skin, but it wasn't the flames that made her sweat. It was the fear, the uncertainty, and the realization that her life now hung in the balance of the standoff between Samuel and the Apache warriors. She wanted to speak, to plead for her life, but the words caught in her throat. She knew it was not just her life at stake anymore. It was the future of the Apache people, the settlers, and even Samuel. She could feel her fate intertwining with theirs. Just as the tension reached its peak, another voice broke the silence. This time it wasn't Tasha or Samuel, but an older man, the chief of the Apache tribe. He had been watching quietly from the edge of the group, his weathered face unreadable. He was a tall man, his long braided hair silver with age, but his eyes were sharp and full of wisdom. "Enough," the chief said, his voice deep and commanding. The warriors and Samuel turned to look at him. "This has gone on long enough." For a moment, no one moved. The chief's gaze swept over the gathered men, then rested on Zitkala. She could feel his eyes on her, weighing her, measuring her worth. She felt exposed, as though the very core of her soul was being laid bare before this powerful figure. "Zitkala," the chief said, his voice softening, "you have always been different. You have always walked a path that none of us fully understand. But this is not the way. You have chosen a side, and you must face the consequences of that choice." Zitkala's heart sank. It was as if the chief's words were a sentence, a condemnation that she had known in her heart was coming. She had always believed in peace, in bridging the gap between the Apache and the settlers. But in the eyes of the warriors, she had chosen the wrong side, and for that she would pay. The chief turned his gaze to Samuel, his expression unreadable. "And you," he said, his voice cold. "What makes you think you have the right to interfere in Apache affairs? You are not one of us. You do not belong here." Samuel didn't flinch. He stood tall, his eyes locked on the chief's. "I don't belong here, I know that. But I can't stand by and watch a woman be killed when I believe there's another way. We all have to find a way to live together. You can keep fighting, but it will only end in destruction." For a long time, the chief didn't speak. He simply stood there, his eyes on Samuel, his mind clearly working through the words he had heard. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the chief sighed and turned to the warriors. "Release her," he said, his voice softer now but still filled with authority. The warriors looked at one another, stunned by the chief's command. They had expected him to order her death, just as they had expected when they first brought her to the camp. But now something had changed. Perhaps it was Samuel's courage, or perhaps it was the chief's own growing realization that peace was the only way forward. Either way, the warriors obeyed, slowly cutting the ropes that bound Zitkala. As the ropes fell away, Zitkala stood up, her legs unsteady from the rough handling. She looked at Samuel, and in that moment their fates were intertwined. He had saved her life, but the struggle was far from over. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. Their worlds were about to collide in ways neither of them could have predicted. The air was thick with uncertainty as the Apache warriors slowly began to release Zitkala from her bindings. She felt the rough ropes fall away from her wrists, but even as the physical chains were lifted, a new set of invisible ones replaced them. Her freedom was fragile, like the first gust of wind before a storm. Samuel had saved her life, but she knew the danger wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the last of the ropes loosened, she stood slowly, her legs shaky from both fear and exhaustion. The Apache warriors, though they had obeyed the chief's order to release her, still watched her with distrust. They had no love for settlers, and now they saw this lone rancher, Samuel, as an outsider meddling in affairs that didn't concern him. Zitkala could feel the eyes of her people, her former people, pressing into her back. She could sense the judgment, the anger, and the deep-seated fear that her actions had ignited. The chief, though, stood silently, observing the unfolding scene. His face was calm, but his eyes revealed much. He was a man of many years, a leader who had seen both triumph and tragedy, and he had lived long enough to know that the choices of one individual could sometimes change the course of history. Still, he was not easily swayed. In his world, strength was everything. But there was something about Samuel's quiet determination that had made him hesitate. Something in the rancher's eyes that spoke of sincerity, of a belief that peace could be possible, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Zitkala took a deep breath and faced the chief. She knew this was her moment to speak, to defend herself and the life she had chosen. It would be a delicate thing to navigate, as every word could either break her or set her free. She had to tread carefully, choosing each word with care. "Chief," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I never wanted to betray my people, but I believe we must adapt if we are to survive. The world is changing, and we can't ignore it. The settlers, they have come, and they aren't going away. If we continue to fight, we will only destroy ourselves. I want to find a way where we can all live together, side by side, without more bloodshed." Her words hung in the air. The warriors exchanged skeptical looks, but the chief did not respond right away. Zitkala stood tall, feeling both the weight of her decision and the freedom that Samuel's intervention had provided. It was a freedom that could cost them both dearly, but it was one she wasn't ready to give up just yet. Samuel, still standing on horseback, was watching closely, but he didn't say anything. He knew this wasn't his battle to fight. It was Zitkala's. She had to make her case. He had already done what he could. The rest was up to her. The chief's voice broke the silence, deep and slow. "You speak of peace," he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied Zitkala. "But peace is not easy. The settlers do not understand us. They take our land, they destroy our way of life, and they expect us to just accept it. How can we trust them? How can we trust you?" Zitkala felt her chest tighten at his words. She knew they were not just aimed at her, but at all those who had chosen to live among the settlers. For years, the Apache had been pushed off their land, forced to retreat further and further into the wilderness, their homes and traditions trampled underfoot by the growing tide of settlers. It wasn't just a matter of mistrust, it was a matter of survival. "I understand your pain," she said quietly, meeting the chief's gaze. "I feel it too. But fighting will only bring more suffering. We have lost so much already. The land is shrinking. The buffalo are almost gone. Our people are divided. We can't keep going like this." The chief didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the warriors who were watching him closely. His people had always trusted him to lead them through difficult times, but this was a new kind of battle. It wasn't fought with weapons or in the fields, it was fought in the hearts and minds of people who had lived through generations of hardship and violence. After a long moment of silence, the chief spoke again. "You have chosen your path, Zitkala, but I will not make this decision for you. You will have to prove your words with your actions." Zitkala nodded slowly, understanding the weight of the chief's statement. He wasn't offering her an easy way out. If she wanted to prove her beliefs, she would have to fight in a different way, one that didn't involve bloodshed but that required courage and determination. The road ahead would be hard, and she knew that there would be those who would never accept her choices. But she couldn't turn back now. She turned to Samuel, her heart filled with gratitude. He had given her the chance to speak, to explain herself, and now she had to prove that she could live up to the trust he had shown her. "Thank you," she whispered to him, her voice filled with emotion. "You didn't have to do this." Samuel gave her a small nod. "It was the right thing to do. You deserve a chance to live your life as you choose." The words were simple, but they meant the world to her. In a world where everything seemed uncertain, Samuel's belief in her was a lifeline she hadn't expected. The warriors began to stir, and one of them, a man with a deep scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His eyes were cold and his voice hard. "You speak of peace, Zitkala, but what of our people? What will become of us? Can you honestly say that the settlers will give us what we need?" Can you promise us that we will not be erased just like the land we once called ours? Zitkala knew this question would come. She had heard it from others before. The fear that the Apache way of life would vanish forever was a constant shadow over them. The settlers had already taken so much. The idea of giving even more away in the name of peace felt like surrender to some. But Zitkala also knew that the old ways could not survive without change. The settlers were not going to turn back, and the Apache couldn't keep running forever. There had to be a new way forward. I can't promise that the settlers will be perfect, Zitkala said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. I can't promise that everything will be easy, but I believe that if we work together, we can find a way for all of us to live. Not as enemies, but as neighbors, as people who share this land. I know it's hard to trust the settlers, but it's even harder to trust ourselves if we can't learn to change. The scarred warrior didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at her as though trying to weigh the truth of her words. Finally, he turned and looked at the chief, a deep scowl on his face. The chief watched his warriors closely, his sharp eyes noticing every shift in posture, every quiet word exchanged. He was not one to make decisions lightly, and he knew the choice he made would have far-reaching consequences. Enough, the chief said, raising a hand. We will not fight today. But know this, Zitkala, you are walking a difficult path. I will not promise you peace, but I will allow you the chance to prove yourself. Your future and the future of your people will depend on your actions. Zitkala nodded. She had been given a chance, but now she had to take it. She knew that the road ahead would be long and there would be no guarantees. Many of her people would never accept her beliefs, and the settlers might never fully trust the Apache. But if she was to find a way forward, she had to keep trying. For herself, for the Apache, for Samuel. With that, the chief gave a final look to Samuel, and then he turned, signaling the end of the confrontation. The warriors began to move, murmuring among themselves, but their steps were slow and uncertain. The fight was not over, but for the first time, there was a faint glimmer of hope in the air. As Samuel and Zitkala stood together, their futures uncertain, they both knew that this moment would change everything. Whether for better or for worse, they had made a choice. And now the real battle for peace and survival would begin. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with uncertainty. Samuel and Zitkala found themselves caught between two worlds, each one demanding something different from them. For Samuel, it had been an unexpected turn of fate. What had begun as a quiet life on his ranch had now become a fight for survival. Not just for himself, but for someone who had been marked for death by her own people. He had come to the Apache camp to save her, and now he was part of something much larger than he could have ever imagined. For Zitkala, the chief's decision to spare her life was both a gift and a burden. The chief had given her a chance to prove that peace could be possible, but she knew the path ahead would not be easy. The Apache had long been suspicious of the settlers, and many saw her as a traitor for even considering living among them. Her life was no longer just about her. It was about showing her people that peace wasn't weakness, and it was about finding a way to bridge the divide between two cultures that had been at odds for so long. The mornings on the ranch were quiet. Samuel went about his daily tasks, working with the horses and cattle, but his mind was never far from Zitkala. He knew that her life had been spared, but the real challenge had only just begun. The Apache warriors had made it clear that they did not trust him, and it was unlikely that they would ever welcome him into their fold. His role in this conflict was unclear, but one thing was certain: he could not walk away. Zitkala needed him, but it wasn't just the Apache that Samuel had to worry about. The settlers in the nearby town were just as suspicious of anyone who associated with the Apache. Even though Samuel had lived a relatively quiet life, his act of defiance intervening in the Apache camp would not go unnoticed. There would be whispers, there would be rumors, and Samuel knew that one wrong step could make him the target of suspicion or worse. Zitkala, too, had her own battles to face. She had been given a chance by the chief, but she knew it came with conditions. The warriors who had stood against her would not forget the act of mercy that had been shown. They would watch her closely, waiting for her to slip, to prove that she could not live up to her ideals. But it was more than just the warriors she had to worry about. Her own heart was in turmoil, Could she truly find a way to live in peace with the settlers? Could she convince the Apache that change was possible, without losing everything that made her one of them? One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Samuel made his way to the small cabin where Zitkala was staying on his land. The ranch was isolated, nestled in a valley surrounded by thick trees and open fields far from the settlements. It was a quiet place, but it also felt like a world of its own. A world where Samuel could keep an eye on the Apache and protect the woman who had come to mean more to him than he had ever expected. When Samuel arrived, he found Zitkala sitting on the porch, looking out at the vast empty landscape. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant. Her posture slumped as though the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. "You look like you've been awake for hours," Samuel said as he approached. Zitkala turned and gave him a small, tired smile. "I have been," she replied. "There's a lot on my mind." Samuel sat down beside her, his gaze following hers across the field. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, but it was also heavy, filled with unspoken words. Finally, Samuel broke the stillness. "You're thinking about the Apache, aren't you?" Zitkala nodded. "I can't stop thinking about them. What's next? Will they ever accept me again? Will they ever forgive me for wanting peace? I thought they would see reason, but now I'm not so sure." Samuel watched her carefully, his expression thoughtful. He had never known what it was like to be torn between two worlds like she was. The settlers, for all their faults, had given him a place to call home. He had never had to choose between two cultures, and so he couldn't fully understand her struggles. But he knew what it meant to fight for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. "You can't control how they feel," Samuel said gently. "All you can do is be true to yourself. You've chosen your path, and I believe in it. You're stronger than you think." Zitkala sighed, her shoulders sinking as if the weight of the world had returned to her back. "I don't know if I'm strong enough. I've lost so much. My people, my place in the tribe. I'm an outsider in both worlds now. The settlers don't trust me because of where I come from, and the Apache don't trust me because of what I believe." Samuel turned toward her, his eyes softening with sympathy. "You haven't lost everything. You still have a future, and you have me if you'll let me help." Zitkala met his gaze, her eyes wide with surprise. She hadn't expected him to say that. It was one thing for him to stand up for her when her life was in danger, but this was different. He was offering to stand by her, to fight for her in ways that went beyond just saving her life. It was a promise, a commitment, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. "I don't want to drag you into this," she said softly. "You've already done more than I could ever ask. But you don't understand what it's like to be caught between two worlds. You don't know how it feels to lose everything, to feel like you don't belong anywhere." Samuel reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. "I can't say that I understand, but I'm willing to learn. I'm here for you, Zitkala. If you want to try, we can try together." Zitkala looked at him for a long time, and in his eyes she saw nothing but sincerity. His words were simple, but they carried weight. In a world that had torn her apart, Samuel's offer was the first thing that felt like hope. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling her heart swell with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "I don't know where this will go, but I'm glad you're here." Samuel smiled, his eyes warm. "I'm not going anywhere." In the days that followed, Samuel and Zitkala began to take small steps toward a new kind of life. Samuel continued his work on the ranch, but now he made more effort to connect with the local settlers. He talked to the people in the nearby town, trying to gauge how they felt about the Apache, trying to gauge how they might feel about Zitkala's presence. It wasn't easy. There were still many who saw the Apache as enemies, and they didn't trust anyone who had ties to them. Zitkala, meanwhile, began to visit the nearby Apache camp again. The warriors and elders still watched her with suspicion, but she didn't back down. She knew that if she wanted to prove her beliefs, she had to be brave. She would speak to them one by one, trying to convince them that peace was worth pursuing, that there was a future where they could live side by side with the settlers. But it wasn't easy. The walls between them were thick and the distrust ran deep. But slowly, something began to change. One by one, the people in both worlds began to listen. It wasn't much, just small steps, but it was progress. And in a world where everything seemed divided, progress was a victory. As Samuel and Zitkala worked together, their bond grew stronger. They didn't have all the answers, but they were willing to face the challenges together, side by side. And in that quiet, isolated place, surrounded by fields and forests, they began to build something new, a bridge between two worlds, one step at a time. As the weeks turned into months, things slowly began to change. Samuel and Zitkala had become a quiet symbol of what could be possible in a world torn by division. The settlers and the Apache remained distant from each other, but the seeds of understanding had been planted. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, fear, and misunderstanding, but each step forward, no matter how small, felt like a victory. Samuel continued to work on his ranch, but now his focus was divided. He wasn't just concerned about cattle and crops anymore. He was concerned about what was happening to the people around him. The settlers were beginning to notice that he wasn't just the quiet rancher they had always known. He was taking a stand, talking about peace and cooperation, and some of them didn't like it. It was hard for them to understand why anyone would want to work with the Apache, the people who they had been taught to fear. Samuel knew that if he was going to help Zitkala and her people, he would have to win over the settlers too. Meanwhile, Zitkala kept visiting the Apache camp. She wasn't expecting miracles, but she was determined to show them that peace wasn't impossible. She had grown up with these people. They were her family, even if they couldn't see her as one of their own anymore. She knew that convincing them wouldn't be easy, but she refused to give up. Every visit to the camp, every conversation she had with the warriors and the elders was another step toward something bigger. But progress was slow. The distrust that had been built up over generations couldn't be erased in just a few months. Many of the Apache, especially the younger warriors, saw any form of cooperation with the settlers as a betrayal. They had lost too much to just accept that things could change. Zitkala often found herself in difficult conversations, explaining her position over and over again, hoping for understanding that sometimes didn't come. One afternoon, as she made her way to the camp once more, she found herself questioning everything. She had given so much of herself to this cause, and yet the walls between the Apache and the settlers seemed as high as ever. The weight of the situation pressed down on her. Could she really change anything? Could one person, no matter how strong their beliefs, really make a difference? As she approached the camp, she saw Tasha, the young warrior who had once been the first to oppose her. He was sitting alone by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. Zitkala hesitated for a moment but then walked over to him. She had seen him around often, but they hadn't spoken much since the day the chief spared her life. He had been one of the most vocal in opposing her and her ideas. Tasha looked up as she approached. His expression was guarded, but there was something in his eyes, perhaps curiosity or frustration, that made Zitkala take a deep breath before speaking. "Tasha," she said softly, sitting down beside him. "How are you?" He gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I am well enough. But I know you are not here just to ask how I am." Zitkala smiled sadly. "No, I'm not. I know things have been difficult between us, but I don't want us to be enemies. I want to understand. Why do you think peace is impossible?" Tasha's face hardened and he turned his gaze back to the fire. "You are speaking of peace, but you forget the years of bloodshed. The settlers came, took our land, killed our people. They do not deserve peace." Zitkala nodded, her heart heavy. She knew the pain that Tasha carried. She had lived through it too. "I haven't forgotten," she said quietly. "But what will it take for this to end? More fighting? More deaths? We're all losing, Tasha. We have lost our land, but we are losing our souls too. If we keep fighting, we will have nothing left." Tasha was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. Zitkala could tell that her words had struck something deep inside him. She didn't know if they would ever fully understand each other, but maybe, just maybe, she had planted a seed. It wasn't about convincing him in a single conversation. It was about showing him over time that peace was possible. Meanwhile, things were changing on the settlers' side as well. Samuel had started to speak more openly to the townspeople, telling them about his experiences with Zitkala and the Apache. Some were receptive, intrigued by the idea that there could be a way to live together. But others were not so kind. Whispers began to spread about Samuel's strange behavior. People began to question his loyalty. How could he, a settler, side with the Apache? It wasn't just rumors anymore. There were calls for Samuel to be watched closely, even suspected of harboring a dangerous alliance with the Apache. It wasn't long before the tension reached a boiling point. One evening, as Samuel was returning to his ranch from town, he found a group of men waiting for him. They had been talking about him for days, watching him, and now they had made up their minds. Samuel was a threat. They didn't care about his past or his work on the ranch, they only cared about his involvement with the Apache. In their eyes, that was enough to brand him an enemy. They confronted him as soon as he stepped off his horse. "You're a traitor, Samuel," one man shouted. "You've been meeting with the Apache. You're putting all of us in danger." Samuel stood tall, his expression calm but firm. "I'm not a traitor. I'm trying to stop this madness before it destroys everyone." "You're the one who's mad," another man spat. "You've been blinded by their lies. The Apache want our land and you're helping them." Samuel shook his head. "It's not about land, it's about peace. If we don't find a way to live together, we'll destroy each other." The men sneered. "You're a fool, Samuel. And you're not going to get away with this, we'll make sure of it." Before they could do anything, a figure appeared on the horizon, riding fast towards them. Samuel's heart skipped a beat as he saw the familiar silhouette. It was Zitkala. She had come to him even though she knew the danger. She had heard the rumors, the threats. But she wasn't going to let Samuel face this alone. She rode up to the group, her horse's hooves kicking up the dirt. "Leave him alone," she called, her voice steady and strong. "You don't know what you're talking about." The men turned to face her, surprise and suspicion on their faces. "And what do you know, Apache?" one man snarled. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here because I believe in peace," she said, her eyes meeting theirs without fear. "And I'm here to stop the fighting. It's time for all of us to move forward. If we don't, we'll be lost forever." There was a long, tense silence as the men looked at one another. They hadn't expected this. Zitkala's words hit harder than they had anticipated. One by one they began to murmur, but none of them took action. Finally one of them spoke, his voice softer now. Maybe there's a chance for peace. But it's going to take more than words." Zitkala nodded. "I know. It's going to take all of us working together." The men didn't say anything more. Slowly they turned and walked away, their heads down, as if the weight of her words had started to sink in. They didn't trust her completely yet, but they were listening, and that was all that mattered. It was the first real step toward something better. As the group disappeared into the distance, Samuel turned to Zitkala. "Thank you," he said softly. "You saved me again." She smiled, but there was no joy in her expression. "We're saving each other," she replied. "But the road is long, and it's not over yet." Samuel nodded. They both knew the battle wasn't finished. The journey for peace would be hard, and there would be setbacks. But they had taken the first step, and for the first time, there was hope on the horizon. They had started something together, a quiet rebellion against hatred and division. It wasn't a war they were fighting. It was a fight for understanding, for a future where both the settlers and the Apache could coexist. It wouldn't be easy, and they didn't have all the answers. But they had each other, and together they would keep moving forward one step at a time.